So today's lecture is going to go over the actual fighting of World War One. We're going to go from about 1914 all the way up to near the end of the war. So this is going to be the changes in warfare and how the war was actually fought. So some of the vocab for today is a stalemate is a deadlock where neither side is able to move. So think of if you're watching football and both the offensive line and the defensive line are really, really good and neither can break through. They're at a stalemate. A Zeppelin, you've probably seen one before. Think of the Goodyear blimp. It's just a giant blimp. A U-boat just means undersea boat. So it's a German submarine. Convoys are merchant ships. So merchant ships are unarmed ships. They're the ships that carry goods, and the convoys are putting a bunch of them together to protect them from U-boats and warships trying to sink them. The Dardanelles are an area, I'll go over it on a map, but they connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea, and it's a very important shipping area. Two things that you need to understand is a front and a theater. So a front is where fighting is happening between armies. So anywhere where armies are actually fighting each other, that's called a front. A theater in warfare is the geographic area where warfare is occurring. So there can be the eastern theater of warfare, but a front is a very specific place. So theater is larger than a front. So World War I is also called the Great War because of just the size of it. Before World War I, wars were usually fought during specific seasons, mostly during the summer, and they involve relatively little amounts of troops and people from the various nations that were fighting. But World War I really changes all of that. You can see these numbers here. These are the amount of soldiers that the nations actually send into the lines. So it's just a huge war. It's going to be what we call total war, which we'll go over a little bit in the next notes. So the massive casualties from World War I, which again you will see, and the trench warfare, which we'll go over, are caused because of the new weapons, those industrialized weapons that countries can create. So number one is the machine gun. The machine gun is fully developed during this time. It's very deadly, so it's hard for armies to actually attack each other. Long-range artillery, it's able to fire shells, explosive shells 10 miles away, and actually artillery will kill the most soldiers during World War I. You combine these two things together and it makes it so it's too deadly to attack the enemy. So the only thing you can do is dig down into trenches to defend yourself. Eventually, chemical weapons, gas will be used, and because soldiers are in those trenches and it's too hard to attack them, gas will be used to try and blind, suffocate, burn, kill the soldiers in the trenches so then your soldiers can attack. But eventually, the gas mask is developed and the chemical weapons aren't as effective. One of the things with World War I is nations put all of their science and all of their industry into the war to make more and deadlier ways of killing enemy soldiers. That will lead to developments like the tank, which is developed to cross no man's land, which again we will go over, but that space in between the trenches. Eventually, airplanes and zeppelins, which had been around for a little while, are going to be used to, at first, just observe troops on the ground and gather intelligence on the enemy, but then eventually used to bomb and attack troops in the trenches and eventually shoot down each other. Submarines and U-boats, so the same thing. U-boats are submarines. They're going to be used to attack nations industrially, try and sink their merchant ships, those ships that carry goods back and forth, and sink enemy warships. But then those convoys that we went over in the vocab will be developed to help protect the merchant ships. So World War I is a industrial war. It's a scientific war where nations put all of their energy into basically creating new and better ways of killing each other. So these are the different areas where combat was actually occurring during World War I. So this area over here, Germany and Russia, we're going to call that the Eastern Front. So this is the East. And it runs from roughly this area all the way down through Romania here. So if you follow this gray line here, that's about the Eastern Front. This area here that I'll write in blue, this is going to be called the Western Front, or purple, I guess. This is going to be called the Western Front. It's a much smaller area. This is going to be where the United States lands its troops, and we're going to focus most of our time. There's going to be a front around here called the Alpine Front. There's going to be a bunch of different fronts down here that we will go over in the notes. And then there's going to be combat up in the seas up here between mostly Britain and Germany. These two fronts are going to be the main show, though, where most of the combat actually occurs. So I would suggest going back to the notes and pulling them up and watching this video from the History Channel about combat during World War I and what a trench is like. If it's blocked, just send me that it's blocked and I'll try to get it unblocked for you. This video also kind of goes over the tech developments during World War I and how technology changed to make the war more deadly. So you can see here some of the advancements in World War I. We have tanks that are totally different from anything that we have today, but they're beginning to look a little more modern. We have the machine gun, chemical weapons. You can see the gas being used here, drifting towards enemy lines. A Zeppelin, long-range artillery. So when I said long-range artillery, this is a railroad gun. You can see how large the artillery guns have gotten. A British tank, airplanes, soldiers loading gas shells, a U-boat, very small submarines, and more artillery. So we'll start with what's called the Western Front up here, and this is going to be mostly Germany versus France, Britain, Belgium, and eventually the United States. And it's the area that runs all the way from the English Channel. We'll have a map on the next slide to look at, all the way down to the Swiss border. So a little bit about the Western Front. So the Germans used what's called the Schifflin Plan, and we've already gone through it when we talked about the start of World War I. They invade Belgium, and the goal is to take out France quickly. They want to come down, capture Paris, knock the French out of the war as quick as they can. But the Germans are stopped by the British and the French at what's called the Battle of the Marne. The Russians then mobilized on the eastern side very quickly, and the Germans had to send a bunch of troops out to fight the Russians, which means that the Western Front turned into trench warfare. So trench warfare is the use of tunnels, the use of trenches, the use of bunkers, because it's too deadly to attack anymore because of machine guns, artillery, and gas. So you just have to kind of dig into the ground and hold your ground where you are. This is kind of shown how deadly it is by the Battle of the Somme, where a whole British army tries to attack the German trenches, and the whole British army is completely destroyed. This happens out in what's called no man's land, and no man's land is the empty stretch between trenches. And the reason they call it no man's land is because no man can live in that area. If you go out into that area, you're going to die. It's too deadly. And for about 4 years, neither side can advance because the military technology is too good. The offensive technology to attack is too good, or to defend is too good, and it costs too many soldiers to actually try and take somebody else's trench. So here's the area that's the Western Front. It's in red right here. There's trenches pretty much from all this way, not totally continuous, but pretty much. And it's going to be, as you can see, Germany versus France, what's left of Belgium, and the British Army. The Germans' goal was to kind of, instead of attacking here where the French had their army, the Germans wanted to take their army and go through Belgium, where I'm drawing this line, come down, capture the capital city of France, and knock out the French from the war. Our next big place where the fighting is going to occur is the Eastern Front. And this is in Eastern Europe, where it's Germany and Austria-Hungary, mostly against Russia. This is a super wide front, so there's not a lot of trench warfare. There's not enough men that you can fit into the area to have trenches. So it starts off in 1914, where the Russians actually invade Germany, but the Russians are pretty quickly pushed back by the Germans. The Russians have difficulty actually supplying their troops and getting them the weapons they need. So the Germans, who were transferred from the Western Front, defeat the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg, where an entire Russian army is destroyed. And pretty much the story of the Eastern Front is going to be the Russians slowly pushed back during the war until they are finally knocked out of the war by their own revolution. You can see the Eastern Front here, there's not as much trench warfare. It's mostly out in the open. And you can see the Russian army is not as well supplied as a lot of their contemporaries. The Eastern Front is going to run right about where I put this line. Obviously, it's going to change based on the war. But initially, in blue, the Russians invade this area where I'm drawing the arrow. And then I'll change it to green. The Germans and the Austrians slowly push the Russians back into Russia until in 1917 the Russians exit World War I. Our next front is the Italian or Alpine Front. This occurs mostly in the Alps. So this is going to be Italy versus Austria, Hungary, and Germany. So if you remember, Italy was originally in the Central Powers with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they had that secret treaty with France. So they switch sides and Italy joins the Allies because A, they have to honor their secret treaty with France, but they also want Austrian lands in the Alps after the war. So this fighting is in the mountains. You can see the mountain troops here. It's in the snow. They're using skis. It does have trench warfare up in the mountains. And it doesn't initially go very well for the Italians. At the Battle of Caporetto, the Italians lose a major battle, and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians slowly begin to push the Italians back into Italy. But the British and the French send over some extra troops, and pretty much the Italian front also turns into trench warfare where neither side can move. So if you're confused on trench warfare, this is trench warfare right here. It's literally digging into the ground and holding your position because it's too deadly to advance. So our Italian front is going to occur mostly in this area where I just drew the red line. And like I told you before on the notes, at the start, the Austro-Hungarians will win a battle here and they'll begin pushing into Italy, but eventually the French and the British will send over troops, and the line will pretty much stay in this area for the rest of the war. Our next front that we go over is the Macedonian or Balkan Theater. So the Balkans is where the war really started, but this is going to be where two new powers join the war. First, Bulgaria ends up joining the Central Powers because they hated Serbia and they were their rival. So the Central Powers help Bulgaria actually take Serbia and then continue to attack Greece. Then Romania and Greece get drawn into the war because Romania wanted to take land from Hungary that they wanted. So the Romanians are going to help the Russians a little bit, but they are eventually going to be knocked out of the war by the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And then Greece, because it will be attacked by the Bulgarians, joins to help the Allies. So now we have three new powers that have kind of joined the war. So in this light blue color, I will label who kind of joins who. The Italians are obviously with the Allies at this point. The Serbs are with the Allies. The Romanians join, and the Greeks join. And then in yellow, the Bulgarians join the Central Power. So our front, which I'll put in red for this area, it's going to be located mostly right here. Serbia will be taken over. Greece and Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary will then fight along this line for pretty much the rest of the war. So the Middle Eastern theater is a large area. It's going to be the Ottoman Empire pretty much versus all the allies. And it's over this area right here. If you look up where my mouse is, the Dardanelles. So the Allies were using the Mediterranean Sea to get supplies to the Russians, because if you remember, the Russians couldn't supply their own army that well. So the Turks obviously cut off the Dardanelles, so the Allies can't do that. The Allies then launched what's called the Gallipoli campaign, where the British use their colonial troops, so New Zealanders, Australians, Indians, and they invade an area called Gallipoli, and they try and take out the Ottoman Empire. It ends up being a disaster, and the Allies have to withdraw. Overall, though, the war goes very poorly for the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs that the Ottomans control, so if you remember back to our first lesson on World War I, the Ottomans controlled a bunch of different ethnic groups that weren't Ottoman. And the Arabs don't want to be ruled by the Ottomans, they want to be ruled by the Arabs. So the Arabs revolt with the help of this guy, a British colonel who supplies them, and he becomes known as Lawrence of Arabia. They start a revolt that further kind of damages the Ottoman Empire. So our Middle Eastern theater is mostly going to occur in this area around here where I put the red line, and then all throughout this area that I'm going to circle. There's huge battles over this area. This is where the Arab Revolt occurs, and it's mostly going to be the British and French supporting this revolt, and then obviously the British landing their troops in this area for Gallipoli. The colonies also get drawn into the war. So Japan, even though it's on the other side of the world, joins the Allies and attacks the German colonies and pretty much takes them over immediately. The German colonies get overrun by the Allies very, very quickly. The Allies have more colonies, they have more troops there, and Germany's focusing on fighting that war in the Europe, so they don't focus on their colonies. And a lot of colonial troops are used by the Allies, especially. They bring in their soldiers from the colonies. So we have Indian troops for Britain fighting in France. These are Vietnamese troops, French. They're going to be shipped over to Belgium to fight. And then we have German colonial African troops fighting in Africa. A lot of these soldiers from the colonies, they fight for their colonizer because they feel if they fight, they can get their country independence after because they've proved how loyal they are to their colonizing nation. So I hope this helps make sense out of the actual fighting in World War I. And if you have any questions, just let me know.